They feared your silence because it meant you chose yourself. Your silence was a rebellion against their chaos. They broke down, and your quiet became their reckoning. Your silence told stories their words could never tell. The quiet you wore was armor stronger than steel. They feared your silence because it wasn't begging for return. Your silence was a poem written in the language of strength. They broke down, but your quiet stayed unshaken like a mountain. Your silence was a sacred vow to yourself. The quiet you kept was a universe expanding beyond their reach. They feared your silence because it was your soul's loudest roar. Your silence was a sanctuary from their storm. They broke apart, and your quiet was the calm after their destruction. Your silence was a seed from which your healing bloomed. The quiet you chose was the loudest act of self-love. They feared your silence because it meant you finally believed in yourself. Their fear grew because your silence spoke louder than their lies. You stayed quiet, and they heard the truth they ignored. Your silence was a gentle earthquake breaking their fragile facade. They crumbled while you mastered the art of stillness. The quiet you kept was the thunder they never saw coming. Your silence wasn't weakness, it was the roar of your soul. They feared your stillness because it meant you moved beyond pain. Your silence held the gravity that pulled their guilt to the surface. They broke down, but your quiet became your wings. You held your silence like a secret weapon they never understood. Your quiet was the unspoken truth they desperately tried to avoid. They shattered, but your silence was a crystal fortress unbreakable. Your silence was a sacred boundary they dared not cross. They feared your silence because it was the sound of your freedom. Your quiet was a lighthouse guiding you away from their storm. You stayed silent, letting their chaos reveal itself fully. The silence you kept was a flame burning away their illusions. They broke apart while your quiet became the anchor of your soul. Your silence was the final lesson they refused to learn. They feared your quiet because it meant you no longer needed them. Your silence was a sacred pause before your next breath of freedom. They crumbled, and your silence was the sound of your healing. Your quiet spoke volumes that no words ever could. They feared your silence because it meant you chose yourself first. The quiet you held was the loudest declaration of your worth. You stayed silent, becoming a storm no one could predict. Your silence was the calm eye in their chaos. They broke inside, but your quiet was a temple of strength. Your silence was a prayer whispered only for yourself. They feared the quiet because it was your soul's loudest scream. Your silence became a river, washing away their hold on you. You held your silence like a shield made of stars. Their breakdown echoed, but your quiet was a fortress of peace. Your silence was the night sky holding their fading light. They feared your silence because it was the sound of your rebirth. Your quiet was a sacred space where your soul found refuge. They crumbled, and your silence became the dawn of your freedom. Your silence held the wisdom of 1,000 unspoken truths. They feared your silence because it was your final, beautiful goodbye. Your quiet was a river carving new paths through old wounds. They broke down, but your silence was the steady pulse of your heart. Your silence was the song your soul sang when words failed. They feared your quiet because it was the voice of your self-love. You stayed silent, letting their collapse reveal your way. Your silence was a sacred fire consuming their hold on you. They crumbled while your quiet forged your unshakable core. Your silence held the power to heal the deepest scars. They feared the quiet because it was the truth they couldn't face. Your silence was a cosmic dance of strength and surrender. You held your silence like a promise to never return. Their breakdown was the soundtrack to your silent liberation. Your quiet was the language your soul learned to speak. They feared your silence because it meant you loved yourself fiercely. Your silence was a mirror reflecting all they lost forever. You stayed silent, knowing your peace was worth more than noise. Your quiet was a blessing wrapped in the pain they caused. They broke apart, but your silence was the seed of your new life. Your silence was the final chapter they never got to read. They feared your quiet because it was your soul's strongest armor. Your silence was the sacred ground where you planted your healing. They crumbled while your quiet was the calm after every storm. Your silence spoke the love you reclaimed for yourself. They feared your silence because it meant your heart beat without them. You stayed silent, holding a power no one could take away. My dear, the silence you kept while they shattered was louder than any scream they feared. Their tears fell heavy, but your quiet strength broke their pride. You didn't say a word, yet your silence shouted all they needed to hear. When you stayed silent, their fear whispered truths they'd never confess. Silence was your fortress while they crumbled inside. They trembled not because you spoke, but because you didn't. You held your peace, and they faced their chaos alone. The quiet you chose made their storm look small. Your silence was a sharp blade they couldn't escape. When words failed you, silence became your fiercest shield. They broke down, but your stillness made them break harder. Your silence spoke the honesty they refused to see. In your quiet, they found the loudest truth about themselves. The way you held back words scared them more than any fight. Your silence was the weight that made their guilt heavier. You didn't need to yell. Your silence was the punishment. They fell apart while your silence held space for everything they hid. The quiet you chose was the shadow that haunted their peace. Their breakdown was your silent victory. They feared your silence because it knew all their secrets. Your silence was a mirror reflecting their deepest fears. While they unraveled, you stood still, unbreakable. Your silence was the loudest truth they ever heard. When they shattered, your quiet shattered their illusions. The silence you wore was heavier than any apology. They feared your quiet because it meant you no longer needed them. Your silence whispered, "I'm done." You stayed silent, and in that silence, they saw their own reflection. Their breakdown was the price for your calm refusal. The silence between you held more power than 1,000 words. You never screamed, but your silence burned like fire. Their fear grew because your silence didn't beg for their return. They broke inside, and your silence was the final goodbye. You didn't raise your voice, you raised the weight of your silence. Your quiet made their lies collapse like paper. The silence you kept was louder than their regret. You stayed silent, and that silence became their prison. Their cries echoed while your silence drowned them out. Your silence made their breakdown inevitable. They feared your stillness because it meant you moved on. The quiet you held was the calm before their storm of regret. You spoke no words, yet your silence healed your soul. Your silence screamed everything they wished you would say. When they broke, your silence became their fear's anthem. The silence you kept made them realize who you really were. They feared your silence because it was your final answer. Your quiet was a hurricane in their fragile world. You didn't shout. Your silence shattered their illusions. Your silence was the language of your self-respect. They broke down, and your silence was the proof of your strength. Your silence was a sacred space where you rebuilt yourself. They feared the quiet because it meant you found peace without them. The silence you chose was louder than any confrontation. You stayed still, and that stillness terrified them. Your silence echoed through their soul, haunting every regret. When they crumbled, your quiet became their worst nightmare. Your silence was a light exposing their darkness. They feared your quiet strength more than your anger. Your silence was the answer to questions they never dared ask. They fell apart, and your silence held the final truth. Your silence was a storm they couldn't outrun. They feared your silence because it held no promises. You didn't break, you stayed silent and unshaken. Your silence was the last page in their story with you. They broke down, but your silence rebuilt you. The quiet you kept was a wound they couldn't heal. Your silence was the shadow they couldn't escape. They feared your silence because it was pure, unshakable truth. Your quiet was a mirror reflecting what they lost. When they fell, your silence was the ground beneath their feet. Your silence screamed louder than any goodbye. They feared the silence because it meant you loved yourself more. Your quiet made them realize they lost something precious. They broke down, and your silence was the sound of your freedom. Your silence held the power they never deserved. When they fell apart, your quiet stayed whole. Your silence was the calm after their chaos. They feared your silence because it meant you were finally free. Your quiet was the song of your soul healing. If this touched your soul, don't scroll, like, comment your favorite quote, and subscribe for more. Your silence became the echo they could never silence. They broke inside while your quiet forged your strength anew. Your silence held space where love once lived. Now, peace. The quiet you banked was a lighthouse in their storm of lies.